Thanks for having me out here.
Yeah, thanks,
part
Robert.
of our latest tour of Seattle's new startups and new companies, new technology. So
Cool
who are
stuff.
you?
So I'm Scott Roza, CEO of Skytap.
Okay, and what the heck is Skytap?
So Skytap is an emerging kind of cloud computing company that's really essentially serving up virtual labs, almost a virtual data center for testers, developers, QA folks, anyone that wants access to virtual machine or virtual machine stacks in the cloud.
Okay, so is this like what Amazon's doing with web services, or is it, you know, because I know a lot of startups are using S3 and EC2, but...
Right, no, that's a good question. I mean, and a lot of times that's one of the first questions we get when we talk to customers. How are you different from Amazon? And if you look at an Amazon EC2 or you look at Google and Google Apps, what they really want developers to do is to develop on that platform.
Yeah.
And the way we're different is we tell developers, you know, if you're a Microsoft developer developing on the Microsoft stack or you're developing Linux apps, you know, that you don't have to change those apps to basically test them or use them in our cloud.
So if I'm building a Windows, a regular Windows app like Microsoft Office, I could use your services to test? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, typically what we see is we see someone who's basically, you know, building an app and they're going to have a web server, an app server, a database server, and it could be the Windows stack or it could be the Linux stack. And what they want to do is they want to test that application.
Okay.
So we're basically a virtual test lab in the cloud.
Got it. Because as we know, I used to work at Microsoft. Like Microsoft Office is made for 4 different OSs and 30 different languages, and testing all that takes a lot of hardware, right?
Yeah, I mean, testers today have a bunch of different pain points, one of which is, you know, at a very rudimentary level, they rely on IT to manage their lab.
Okay.
So rather than rely on IT to build their lab, manage their lab, procure their lab, get all the physical hardware, we're basically that same lab, but in the cloud, 100% on demand, on tap.
Okay.
So someone could go into the lab basically as part of the subscription and basically look at our library of images, OS images, kind of build the lab the way they want it to be built, upload their application for testing, and then run their tests.
Interesting. It makes total sense for somebody who's building an application that's going to go on a desktop.
Right.
Yeah, like the Internet Explorer team and Microsoft, I totally get why they would use something like this, right? Because they could test out a lot of different iterations on a lot of different OSs really fast, and they wouldn't have to own the hardware, they wouldn't have to go around with CDs and reload everything. Right. Totally makes sense. What about somebody who's building a cloud-based app, somebody who's building a web app, where the servers are going to, you know, live somewhere else? They probably are even hosting it on something like Amazon's S3. Is there a place for that kind of system to be
absolutely.
tested?
I mean, there's tons of different companies that are emerging as SaaS companies, right? Rather than the traditional on-premise shippable software application where you might, you know, you have a broader compatibility matrix from an OS perspective.
Yeah.
You know, even a SaaS-based app still has the same similar testing requirements, but usually around browser compatibility and different configurations they want to run.
Right.
So we find that that's just as rich of a market as the traditional on-premise software market.
So I'd need to see you and set up a Linux box with Mozilla and a Mac box with Firefox and Opera and Safari, and then set up another set of Windows machines with different things and maybe even different languages to make sure it all looks good.
And actually, even though the testing on a traditional, you know, the test matrix might be more complex for a traditional on-premise application, typically their cycles for release are longer, whereas a web app or a SaaS-based app or offering is going to have much shorter release cycles. So they're going to have shorter release, more intense testing, maybe not as complex of a matrix.
Yeah. Now, why don't you just test that with Parallels or VMware or something on your local machine? Why? Because you can certainly have a library of different OS installs that go into VMware, right?
Yeah,
I have Parallels and I have Windows running on my Mac, right? What's the advantage of using your service over that?
It's interesting. When we talk to customers, probably about 70% of them are actually using virtualization heavily, quite heavily, usually VMware, some Zen as well. And what we find is that as development organizations have become more distributed, and testing organizations, a lot of times it's global. Obviously a lot of folks are using people in India.
Yep.
They find that having that local central repository in the cloud helps with collaboration. Right?
Oh, okay.
So typically, yeah, if you have a very small organization, they might be able to get by saying, hey, we're going to have a very small test lab in the closet running VMware, and we can all have access to it. But typically, once shops start to grow and do any kind of outsourced QA and test, what they find is collaboration around those virtual machine images and sharing those images becomes really painful.
No,
and because it's so easy to create the virtual machine images, all of a sudden you go from having one machine, if it's physical, to 20 or 30 that are virtual, and sharing those when you're not using the cloud becomes very complex and painful.
And
because they're not small images, they're large images.
Yeah. That's really interesting because a lot of the startups in San Francisco that I'm talking with have development teams, sometimes even two separate development teams. One's in India and one's in Bulgaria, or one's in Prague, or one's in, Israel. I just visited Israel, and there's a lot of development going on there. Checkpoint has a development team in Israel and in the United States.
Absolutely.
Right, and so now they could actually load up a bunch of machines and see the problems that those machines are, because you can just sign in with your browser and see what Windows looks like and what the app that you're testing looks like on that browser.
Yeah, even better, we have some of the functionality in our virtual test lab automation suite focuses on snapshotting. So if you have a tester that's going through the process and they actually find a bug, they can kind of suspend that test right in the middle with the machine state, and they can kind of separate that off, put that in a URL, send it to a specific developer and say, here's the exact machine state when we found this bug. And they're not blocked from testing. They continue with their testing. They've basically created a mirror image of the environment at the time that they found the bug. And then when the developer comes in the morning, if they're around the globe, can basically pick up and say, okay, here's the bug, exactly the same state, and then go ahead and figure out exactly what the root cause is. Okay. Whereas the testers in India, for example, can continue on in their test. So we found, like, one of our very early beta customers was a local company here in Seattle, not a real big shop, but at one time they had about 10 developers that were using Skytap Virtual Lab here in Seattle, and then another 8 to 10 in India. And these guys were literally, pushing code every day, testing every night, and the snapshot feature was basically a trail of breadcrumbs whenever they found bugs.
Okay. When I worked at Microsoft, they had automatic test suites that exercised the apps. Would automatically click on buttons and fill out forms and do stuff to test whether the app was working the same way it was yesterday, right? Right. And can I build those kinds of test suites on top of the virtualization?
Absolutely.
And then run through 16,000 tests every night on my apps and make sure that I can really handle that kind of load. And
our goal is at Skytap is really to be the leader as the virtual lab in the cloud. Okay. It's not to compete with those functional test tools. Right. So just as someone could use, really the paradigm is very much just the same way you use your lab. If it's in your closet, you'd use the virtual lab of Skytap in the cloud the same way.
Oh, very cool.
So folks can basically upload those test tools or those scripts into the cloud and use them, or they could. One of the things we're doing that's probably different for some of the other cloud vendors as well is we have basically lab-to-lab VPN, which allows our cloud to talk to on-premise enterprise stuff as well.
Okay. How does your business work? Because this is a fast company too. So how do you charge for things, and how are you funded, and all that fun stuff? Yeah.
So we're here in Seattle, venture-backed startup, backed by two local firms, Madrona Venture Group and Ignition. Took the lead kind of in our Series A funding, and then also have money from Bezos Expedition, which is, of course, Jeff Bezos' personal investment fund. Yeah. And most of our business, since it's an on-demand in the cloud business, is subscription-based.
Okay. And so if I needed 10 machines or 10 virtual machines, how do I pay for that? Do I pay $20 per machine, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it's pretty simple. We basically say, hey, here's a subscription, and basically you bound the subscription by how many virtual machines and users you need. And we don't have like an infinite number of buckets. We just have a couple of different buckets, and you pick from those, and then the number of virtual machine hours you need as well.
Okay.
So if you're doing a ton of testing across 20 machines, you might say, hey, I need 2,000 virtual machine hours per month. And if you just do a small amount of testing, you might say I need 5 virtual machines and only 100 virtual machine hours a month.
Yep. And all the pricing's up on your website, and I can figure that out pretty easily?
Yeah,
okay.
It's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Yeah, simplicity is one of the things that we're trying to push to make it easy.
And is there anything else I need to know about Skytap?
I think, in terms of, we talked about some of the differentiation, but one of the things we really focus on, and you'll see it in the demo, and we've got a great 3-minute flash demo on our website as well. Ease of use, high usability, self-service. I mean, we're all about that instant gratification for the tester.
And we find it at skytap.com?
Exactly.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for
Thanks,
having
Robert.
me over. And we're
Yeah,
gonna
thanks
get a
for
little
making a
demo
visit.
of what it looks like.
Yeah.
So.